Welcome to my series on grief. This is a professional grief journey as well as a personal grief journey. I'm Christy Bundakumara. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner with over 20 years of clinical experience, but unfortunately I'm an expert in grief because I have lost children. And I think that is super important to talk about here because today I'm going to go over Bowlby's attachment theory. So when we talk about quantifying loss or what is intense grief versus what is normal grief, right? We often, we all have to go through grief and we get that response all the time. Well, grief is normal. Everyone will lose someone. And that is very true. But I have lost children, and I can tell you just emotionally and physically, and the parents that follow me will all say the same thing, that it is different. It feels unbearable. And so there is like differences in types of grief. And this theory, this biological theory of attachment in grief, really makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we know what attachment is, and obviously if you are grieving the loss of anyone, you had some sort of attachment to that person. But there are actually chemical attachments that happen biologically. And so in this theory, they really talk about what is happening in the brain based on this, what we call permanent loss. So there are several chemicals in our brain. One is kind of known as the love chemical. It's called oxytocin. And this is one of the reasons that we talk about the bond between a mother and a child being that kind of strongest attachment. So it's not just psychological, there's actually a biological reason why that is a very strong attachment. So in the birthing process, oxytocin is released and the mother begins to have that chemical bond with the child. This is also kind of solidified or strengthened over the course of breastfeeding because breastfeeding actually increases oxytocin. And so it helps with that bonding. So there are other things that release oxytocin. Intimacy. So it's not just, mother-child bond, but any kind of intimacy. You have, if you have intimate conversations with your mother, your father, your grandfather, like that causes that oxytocin to release as well. And even more so in romantic relationships, specifically, sexual with orgasm, there is actually an oxytocin release during orgasm. So this oxytocin is the love chemical, and it starts to create a biological attachment, so not just a psychological attachment. But there's also other neurotransmitters. We have 26 plus neurotransmitters in our brain. We talk a lot about 3 of them because we know about them. So serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine. And when there is a bond, an attachment, a connection with someone, you actually have an increase in these neurotransmitters. And so that begins to have this chemical connection. So the problem in loss and grief, this attachment grief theory, is that the biological attachment is physically there even though the person has died, right? Like that bond, that attachment is still physically present in your brain. So he's calling it proximity to your attachment. And when you have permanent loss, when the person dies, there is no proximity. And so it causes anxiety and dysfunction. And really, the attachment piece goes into and kind of supports some of the other grief theories that we've talked about. Now, in this attachment theory, he also kind of describes different either steps or elements or things that people go through. It's very similar to the 5 stages of grief that we kind of all learn in school. His first stage is that shock. Second is kind of numbness and denial, which in the 5 stages they kind of put together. His next step is yearning and protest, which I feel like is pretty similar to bargaining. Like you're wishing they were here, you wish you would have done something different, you're kind of protesting that, maybe going into a little bit of anger. And I think sometimes, when we put so much popularity on the 5 stages of grief, as people are developing new theories, there are people that do not experience anger. And I've heard this as I'm reading and studying, that I experience a lot of anger, but there's some people that don't experience anger and grief. And so, kind of changing the words around that, of kind of that internal conflict of, I really miss this person. I want them in my life. I'm very upset that, kind of internally protesting that this is happening to me. His next step is despair, which I think kind of correlates with the 5 stages and depression. But this, kind of the reality that this is real, that, I'm never going to physically see my children again. And then his last stage is a gradual recovery. And a lot of the grief theories kind of talk about this, adjusting, reinvesting in life, gradually accepting, moving on. These are all trigger words for parents who have lost a child, because you feel like you can never accept or move on. But the word recovery has more of a healing. And this, if you're following me on this grief journey, I kind of came to this realization, a little more than a week ago of, I can't fix this. I can't go through 45 days of grief and study all these things and my grief be gone. Like, I can't fix the pain, but I can heal. And so, kind of using words that resonate with you as you're, studying and trying to reintegrate into the world. And I talk about in another grief theory, like the word reinvest. I like to say embrace life, like how in the midst of my pain, the reality of my loss, the permanency of my loss, the fact that it changed everything about me, how can I still embrace life? Because I know there's so many, specifically parents, and I think that's because, they're following me, I'm getting some of their stories, but they get to the point where they feel like suicide is an option, because it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't, being able to accept or recover or, go through these stages. And I don't want you to think of any of these theories as stages. Like, it's not a step-by-step. It's not tasks that if you complete these, you will be better, right? But it has been helpful for me, and I'm a professional with a degree, and maybe I think I know everything, right? It has been helpful for me to study these grief theories in the context of which they were written, but also in the context of myself, and just be honest. Like, that word, acceptance, move on, is a trigger for me. I don't have to use that word. But I also need to understand that this is very complex, and theorists are trying to kind of give words to the pain and the process. So what I got most out of this attachment theory is that biological connection. I mean, I know about oxytocin, but it's almost like you had to be reminded. And I think that this is also why, the losing a child just seems so much more intense and unbearable than, another loss. And not to be comparatively, but those mothers, fathers out there who have lost a child feel like it's a different kind of intensity. And so especially, we talked about the oxytocin with the mother during birth, during breastfeeding, but also in any kind of intimate relationship. So if you've lost your husband, your best friend, those kinds of intimate things actually create a chemical attachment. And so some of the feelings that we are feeling as we are going through this process are biological. And I have come to, I'm not going to sever that attachment, right? And I talk about that with some of the other grief theories. I'm working on kind of a spiritual connection and those kinds of things. But the other components that loss of attachment creates is where we have to kind of untangle all of these things, because intense grief causes everything to kind of come together and get all meshed up, and then you have negative talk, and if there's an injustice, based on your loss, then that comes into play, anger comes into play, and you have all of these things going on at one time. And so I just challenge you to kind of separate grief by itself and making sure that we are processing grief, because that's one of the things that, as I'm looking at all of these theories, it's not that they don't understand what's happening. I think all of these things make sense, and I talk about, the differences and where they make sense for me. But what gets confusing, what causes, prolonged grief disorder or depression, is when everything's getting mixed up. And so studying these grief theories is helping me. So I challenge you to also study these things on your own and just, be honest with yourself where, it doesn't resonate with you, but also I'm learning something new in each grief theory that I look at. So attachment theory is that there is an actual biochemical attachment to your loved one that will need to heal over time. So keep following, keep working on your own grief, and I truly believe that we are all mentally strong.